Okay, welcome back, everybody. Okay, one of the things that we are going to be sure and do is I'm going to record each of these lectures. So I have clicked record, and my plan is to share these with the class, so that you guys will be able to access this if there's anything you want to go back and watch, etc. Okay, I think we spent enough time on this slide, and I'm eager to get into the meat of the presentation. So I really want to just kind of look at this as one example where the geology does play so many important roles for everything else that comes, particularly the plants and the animals. One kind of last neat thing about this site, two final points, I guess. One is I have several colleagues who go and they take their classes here. And every time they've ever gone, they've always seen multiple timber rattlesnakes. I've been to the site 20 times probably, and I've never seen a single timber rattlesnake. I think that just highlights how oblivious sometimes us botanists can be, because I'm sure I have stepped over probably dozens of rattlesnakes at the site and just didn't realize it, but because I'm always looking at plants, right? The final factor that I want to bring to attention here is the human factor. We want to understand this landscape not only through those natural processes, the natural communities, the natural ecosystems and species. We also want to understand it from those abiotic factors, things like the soils or the geology, the hydrology, the landforms. And then we want to understand the people factor, right? For example, the Cherokee burned these mountain slopes and these mountain valleys for thousands of years. It's important for us to know about that and to understand how that fits into this equation. White settlers that came into this region, they also had their own impact on this landscape. A lot of those mountain slopes in the background have been forested and logged, or they've been grazed with cattle or sheep. There's been a lot of alterations to the landscape in the last 200 years. It's important to think about those and how they have changed and modified this land. And then finally, to bring it home, is what do we today as conservationists, what role do we have to play in making sure that this landscape stays as a high quality serpentine barren? We might need to come in with teams of people and conduct prescribed burning here to make sure that it doesn't get overrun with too much woody vegetation. We may need to come in and do other kinds of things like remove invasive species. So the human component is really a critical factor that I hope we will touch on time and time again in this class. All right. Okay, so as we continue over the next few weeks to talk about the development of the North American or Eastern North American landscape, we're going to talk about some big stuff. And ultimately, it comes back to reflect on geology. Rocks are really at the center of it all. So tectonic plates, mountain building, the uplifted domes. Laura asked about the Nashville Dome and what does that mean? And how does that connect to everything? We're going to talk about these are geologic domes, by the way. Depositional basins, erosion of rock, the rifting of continents, like the separation of continents, the formation of intercontinental seaways, the rise of the Rocky Mountains, ice age glaciation, and then global climate change. All of these things are factors that we have to sort of think about and talk about as part of this this journey that we're about to embark on. There's that great book that I want you each to be sure and get, Lost Worlds and Alabama Rocks. You could probably just buy it off of Amazon. There may be a few copies in our bookstore, but definitely get this book. And if you can't, again, I've got the scans for you. This is a geologic map of the Mid-South. This is really kind of the area that we're focused on for this class. You can see it's very complicated over in the region around the Smoky Mountains over here on to the right side. That's a real complicated geology over there. It's more simplified in say over here along the Mississippi River, but to the average person who hasn't really thought a lot about geology, this map might not make sense. But once you learn the basics, you're going to find that there's some really cool things that you can glean from these maps. One of the things that I like here, real quick, I'll point out, then I'll switch off to Laura, for example, is this thing that looks like a bullseye right here. You see that? It's got a couple of concentric circles around it. That actually is down in southwesternmost Montgomery County, just about 15 miles southwest of Clarksville. Does anybody know what that is?
Isn't it a meteor strike area?
Exactly. It's a meteor impact site. It's called the Wells Creek structure, which is named for the creek that flows through it. Laura, you had a question? Laura, you got a question?
I'm doing the mute thing, sorry. When you mentioned the Appalachians and how complex they are, and I see all those colors and I realize, that there's a whole bunch of different things going on. But is that how any mountain range would look, or like would the Rockies be pretty simple relative to this?
Great question. Yeah, generally speaking, the mountain ranges are highly complex because they have taken areas that historically or prehistorically were not mountain ranges, right? These flat landscapes, and pushed them up and melted them and molded them and fused them together in totally new arrangements. And those rocks have broken and faulted and fractured. And some of them, they've been heated up and remelted. So all those things together make these mountain landscapes extremely complicated geologically.
Okay.
And then also it matters when it hasn't been just one mountain building episode. Like in this case, there have been like three. So these mountains have been built up, they eroded down, they've been built up again, they kind of eroded down, and they built up one more time, and that's what we're looking at now. And even they have eroded down. So we're looking at not one, but three mountain building episodes that go back over almost 2 billion years of time.
Okay.
And all those signatures are still there in very complicated ways.
Thank you. So other mountain ranges may be more simple, but they've all got all that going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. One last question before we get off of this map is, what are these black lines here?
Are they faults?
They are. Yeah. Good job, Ken. So those are fault lines. And you might ask the question of, well, why are they where they are, right? Well, you've got a lot of faulting over here where you expect to have a lot of broken rock in the Appalachian region, right? Because that mountain building process has broken all those rock layers. And we'll get into this in depth, but just to kind of give you the highlights, that resulted from Africa colliding with North America. And so that in tremendous force has broken all those rock layers. That's what that faulting is primarily derived from. But what about over here where we don't have mountain building so much? What could explain this huge array of fault lines just up here in Western Kentucky and Southern Illinois and a little bit of Southeast Missouri?
Does it have something to do with the inland sea that used to be in the middle of America?
In a roundabout way, kind of indirectly, but we're going to tie it back to that in just a second. Any other thoughts here as to what that system of faults could represent?
Does it have something to do with the connection of the Mississippi and the Ohio River?
It very much does, although again, sort of to Matthew's point, it's sort of indirectly tied to it. And if you'll notice that it extends all the way up here into far eastern Kentucky as well. But yeah, you're right. Some of those faults extend along the sort of the Ohio River Valley, and then some of them extend upwards along the modern day Mississippi River Valley right here. Just a couple more guesses. Anybody?
Is that the New Madrid fault zone, Dr. Estes?
Yeah, this is definitely connected to the New Madrid fault zone. So some of you probably know that back in like 1811, 1812, Theo, correct me if I'm wrong on those dates, there was a massive system of earthquakes that created Reelfoot Lake over on the Mississippi River. Well, that earthquake alone did not cause those faults, right? But the New Madrid fault is one of many of these fault lines that you see here represented on this map. And ultimately what this gets back to is a very long time ago, and we're going to come to explore that as we get into this class. North America tried to sort of rip apart in the center of the continent. So right here in what is now Tennessee and Arkansas, Missouri, and Kentucky and Illinois, where the Mississippi River comes down, that area was rifting apart. And that term rifting means basically the splitting of a continent. Very much like how today in Ethiopia, in Eastern Africa, you have the African Rift Valley, and it is splitting East Africa apart, eventually into two land masses. Well, in this case, that rifting was very active for a long period of time, and then it stopped, as sometimes rift zones will do. It stopped, and so it prevented North America from being pulled apart. But what it left essentially was all these fault lines, and it also leaves us with an area that is still prone to very active earthquake activity, as in the case of the New Madrid fault zone. Now, what else would you expect along a rift valley where there's the land is literally being ripped apart? Think about Iceland, for example. What are the kinds of things in addition to earthquakes would you anticipate? Anybody?
What about cave systems and sinkholes?
Maybe that's not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about something more violent.
Like volcanoes, perhaps?
Yeah, how about volcanic activity, right? You would expect, Iceland right now is on one of these rift zones, right? And the continent's being just that island's sort of been ripped open. And there are places where the volcanoes are just bellowing forth from the ground. Take a look here at, I know that we don't necessarily have the states clearly identified on this map, but look at this zone right here. This is just south of St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis is about right here. And if you look, this is an area of mountains called the St. Francis Mountains. I'm going to put that in the chat box. And if you look there at all that red and purple, that's a really interesting geology because it's an area of what we call igneous rock, which we're going to get to in a minute. Basically, it's rock that forms from magma or lava. And so a lot of those formations over there, as you would expect, adjacent to a rift zone, had a lot of volcanic activity way back in time. We also see a lot of volcanic rocks in places like Mississippi that are buried. So even though we think today, we don't have any active volcanoes anywhere near Tennessee, as we're going to explore, we do have volcanic, or what we call igneous rocks, still in the region. All right. Okay, let's take a look at this stack of it's something almost no one has anymore. If you have a phone book, or if you know what a phone book is, maybe raise your hand or whatever, but I'm sure everybody remembers these from the 1990s, those of you who were alive back then. This is a stack of 5 large or thick telephone books that have everybody's phone number as it used to be back in the day. And this is a lot of the imagery that I'm going to show you in this class is taken directly from the Lost World in Alabama Rocks Facebook page, and all these are the images used in the book. So as you take a look here, it's just kind of a neat metaphor for understanding Earth history. You can see that the bottom books here all are 1,000 pages each, and then the top book in white has 600 pages in it. If you take a look at this, there's 4,600 pages between all these books. That roughly represents the 4.6 billion years of Earth history. Therefore, each page represents 1 million years of time. or about 50,000 human generations. If you get all the way up to about 4,000 pages in, at the 4,000 page mark, that's where the oldest rocks, if we're equating this to geologic time, that's about where you'd find the oldest rocks known on Earth, are at about the 4,000 page mark. If you go to page 3,900, that's where the oldest primitive cells are, right? The first prokaryotic bacterial cells that we have fossilized. At page 2,500, we have the first free oxygen in the atmosphere. At page 600, the oldest multicellular life, the precursors to, vertebrates and invertebrates, at 600 pages. At page 570, the oldest fossils with hard body parts, things like exoskeletons, so forth. And then just on the last three names of the top page represents all of the span of time of human history. Just on the top three, the last three names on the top page. So that really gives you an idea of just the immense amount of time and change involved in Earth history. So this is a really cool graphic that I like it a lot. All right, one of the most important things that you all are going to need to make sure you're memorizing, and I generally do not like memorization, but you definitely need to know the geologic time scale. Now, you don't need to know everything that's on this scale. I'm going to point out the most important elements for you to know. First of all, you do need to know what we call the eras. That's the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and Precambrian era. Okay. And generally speaking, Paleozoic means the time of ancient life. The Mesozoic means the time of middle life. The Cenozoic refers to the time of current life. Okay, it's just kind of a handy way to kind of keep those straight. We live today in the Cenozoic, and you go back in time, the farther to the right you go on this table. Now, another thing that within this that we need to, and I'm going to look at this in a little bit more of a clearer version here. So you need to know those eras at the top. Then I want you to know all of the periods for the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. And so starting back at the Precambrian period, at the Cambrian period, 540 million years ago, here's the time scale right here on the side of each one of these charts. You need to know Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian. Then we come down here at Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Now we're going to come down here, Paleogene and Neogene. And finally, this period right up here at the top left is the one we live in today called the Quaternary. You need to know all those period names. You need to know them in the correct order. And you need to know approximately when they occurred. So if I were to ask you in class, when was the Silurian? I don't care that it was exactly from, 418 to, 448 million years ago. What I really want you to know is it was about 400 million years ago. It was about 450 million years ago. That's fine. That's as if you just know the relative time frames, generally speaking, for the periods, that's all I want you to know to the nearest, 50 million years. All right. Now, other than the periods, which I've just mentioned, and again, you don't need to know the periods over here for the Precambrian because we don't really concern ourselves with the Precambrian very much. There wasn't a lot of life, complex life going on in the Precambrian. So this whole time period from the Paleozoic to the present is really when we see multicellular life evolve and plants and the kind of things that we all know and love. Okay. Now, the last thing I want you to know is the epochs of the Cenozoic era. Okay, so for the Cenozoic over here, the Paleogene and Neogene periods and Quaternary period, you need to know the Paleocene and Eocene epochs for the Paleogene period. You need to know, and the Oligocene as well. For the Neogene period, you need to know the Miocene and Pliocene epochs. And for the Quaternary period, you need to know the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs. Now, for these, I want you to know pretty precisely the dates of those epochs, okay? The Miocene is roughly 20 million years ago to about 5 or 6 million years ago. You need to know the Miocene dates, generally speaking. The Quaternary, you need to know that was like 2.6 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago. You need to know those time frames. That's going to be very relevant to a lot of our discussions. Okay. Any questions on what you need to know from the geologic time scale? All right, the next up then is I've included these. The image on your right comes from your book. And the image on the left, I just stole it off of Google Images. I like these because the one on the left shows the times where many of our sort of common forms of life, like first reptiles, first amphibians, first land plants, first flowering plants, when they kind of come onto the scene and what geologic period, and approximately how far back in time. I'm not going to test you over this. This is mainly here for your knowledge to kind of help you sort of link up these sort of common, these sort of firsts in evolutionary history. I think it's important to generally know, when these things were kind of coming onto the scene. Because we're going to talk so much about rocks and the specific geologic ages of those rocks throughout this class. You're going to hear me talk a lot about the Cretaceous period. And this is a Cretaceous gravel. And in those gravels, you might expect dinosaur fossils of a certain age. You really need to be able to make sure that you're thinking quick on your feet and that you can link up those geologic names with particular sort of types or groups of rocks and the age of those rocks. That's very important as a foundation for the rest of the class, okay? Now, you might be inclined to sort of use the analogy of the geologic record. It's sort of like a cake, okay? Take a look at this. It's a 5-layer cake. And here, the oldest part of the cake is down on the bottom, right? If you were building this cake in real time, you'd sort of make that layer first, and then you'd add the second one, and the third, and the fourth. And then the youngest layer would be the one you added most recently, would be at the top, okay? So that same analogy holds true of geologic layers, generally speaking. But if you look here on the right, this is more of an actual look at the way those layers look like, let's say for the state of Alabama. Very complicated. You've got all kinds of different sort of zones or layers, as we'll see in a minute. And so it doesn't quite match, what you might expect of this perfect cake layer and sort of flat layers, right? If that were true, then if you looked at the geologic map of Alabama and it was all in these perfectly flat layers, you would expect the very topmost layer, layer E, is kind of what you'd see across the entire state. That's not what you see. You see a very complicated map like the one on the right, where things have been sort of shoved around and moved, and layers have been added and layers have been taken away. And it makes for a very complicated story. This is the map for Tennessee, and I use Alabama a lot in this lecture because of the book, and it's such a great book that has many concepts that are transferable to Tennessee. But I do like to sprinkle in here where I can the geologic map of Tennessee, and we're going to study this a lot too. I mean, don't worry about that. So it'll come to play. One of the things I want you to notice here, when you look at Tennessee, is the geologic eras, right? So there's Precambrian over here, and there's Paleozoic, and there's Mesozoic, and there's Cenozoic. So that's one reason why you need to make sure you know those names. Then if you look within those eras, here are the rocks of those specific time periods. So, for example, a Paleozoic rock, if you're over around Knoxville, you're going to have Cambrian rocks exposed from the Cambrian period. Then you've got Ordovician and Devonian, Silurian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. So these are all, again, very important to know. And eventually you'll want to know kind of where they are. And we're going to do some mapping in this class. So you'll have sort of a concept of where all these rock types are. In many ways, some of the things we'll do for this class it's kind of like stepping back into, elementary school and coloring good old fashioned, coloring books of maps and stuff. I think that's one of the best ways to know this stuff is if you can draw it and color it, then you know it. But going back to Alabama real quick, let's use another analogy. In this case, sort of a deck of cards. If you were to take a deck of cards with just 5 cards, sort of like that 5-layer cake, and then imagine just kind of splaying those cards out a little, right? So they're slightly overlapping. Think about that top card as your youngest card or your youngest layer, and the bottom is your oldest. If you were to look here from this line that's shown on this map, basically you have younger rocks at the bottom of Alabama, down on the Gulf Coast, and the oldest rocks are up at the top. And if you notice here, coming up in Alabama, you can see that you have these sequential sort of layers, almost like concentric rings in a way. And each layer as you move south gets younger and younger and younger. And as you move farther to the north, those rocks, you're going back in time and you're getting older and older. Now imagine you're sitting up here on this beautiful promontory outside Birmingham, Alabama, this mountain. This is Alabama's highest point, by the way, called Mount Chiaha. Imagine you're sitting there. By the way, I would not be on that rock personally. That's not where I'd want to be. But just imagine you're looking out. Have you ever sat on top of a mountain and sort of thought about, man, I wonder what this looked like, 50 years ago or 200 years ago? But have you ever really stopped to think about, man, I wonder what this looked like 80 million years ago or 250 million years? Well, that's what you're going to learn in this class. You're going to learn to understand what landscapes used to look like and what kind of changes that they've gone through. And we're going to sort of teach you in many ways how to use sort of these forensic clues to kind of understand the context of the landscape that you're in. So number one, it's important to realize, and I think this oftentimes just before I started thinking about it several years ago, I had no clue as to how the land used to look, right? I had no clue. But for example, take this this same scene here. It's the same mountain, but it's a different vantage point. Just imagine that big valley off in the distance that you see. You're looking kind of down to the south west, almost like you're looking off toward the Gulf of Mexico, which is about another 150 miles in the distance. Just imagine how much rock has been lost to erosion. I mean, let me let that sink in with you. And then once you've thought about it for a second or two, I'd love to hear from a couple people. Just what do you think about that?
I mean, surely it all had to have gone somewhere. So I'm guessing it was ground down by the receding of the glaciers or eroded and washed out into the ocean, maybe.
Clayton, yeah, that's right. It had to go somewhere, right? So what we want to know is how did it get eroded away and when and where is it today, right? Those are all important questions. So you raised some good possible things to consider. Now, in this case, one just quick thing that I'll kind of highlight is that Alabama and Tennessee, neither one have ever been covered by glaciers. So here we got to look to something else to explain the erosion of all that material. You got any other ideas?
Guess we have rain left over.
You said rain?
Rain, plenty of rainfall, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, could be, right? Water certainly could be involved in that process, but just think about the amount of time, right, that it would take to erode away these low mountains completely and take them away. I mean, we've lost, thousands of cubic kilometers of rock that have just eroded away. So that's going to be an interesting process that we're gonna explore and talk about, especially when we get on in about another couple of weeks of class here. Okay. Awesome. Well, let's visualize this another way. This is not too far outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. This is in North Alabama. Here, what you have is a fairly deep valley that is bordered on both sides by the Cumberland Plateau, which is kind of this uplifted mountain region. You can see those cars in the foreground there. They're driving up out of that valley, right? But if you were to come up to this this road cut over here on the right, take a look, and you'll notice especially, take a look at these rocks right here, just above the words resistant sandstone. Now, you might be inclined to look at the grooves in the rocks down here by the highway and see that they're kind of running up and down, right? But that's just because that's the way the mechanical drills that and the heavy machinery that carved out this notch in the mountainside left those scars there. But if we just looked at the rock layers itself, what we see is that they actually run this way. And you see that they have a good tilt to the upper left in this case. So the implication then is that that particular layer of rock would have kept going up, 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 and finally it folded over and then comes back down on the far ridge in the distance, so that you have the exact same rock layer over there on that far mountain 5 miles away that you have right there in the face of that road cut. In fact, all the same layers are there. So from top to bottom, all the rocks are the same on the east side of the valley as they are over on the far west side of the valley. Now, the implication then is that something tilted those rock layers up in the first place, because generally speaking, we think about those layers as having been laid down originally in sort of a flat profile. Something then caused those layers to arch upward, and then something caused that mountain of rock that essentially would have been a mountain range that is now gone. It caused all that to erode away. So talk to me about that real quick. Any initial thoughts that come to mind? Does that blow anybody's mind? Is anybody, for anyone, is that kind of a new concept that you hadn't considered? Or is that something you already kind of knew?
I was aware of it, but I still just, I try to picture it, it's massive.
Yeah, and Laura, this really is at the core of what you're kind of asking about at the beginning, is how did the Nashville Basin form, right? Well, a lot of times these valleys or these basins, these areas that are topographic low areas, originally were uplifted areas. They were originally mountains or domes. And what happened is when those areas were lifted up, it created these fractures or faults in the rock, and lots of the rocks became broken and fractured. And then what we need to look at is not all rocks in this landscape are created equal, right? Some of the rocks up here in this mountainside here are very hard and strong and resistant. They're sandstones. They're very tough and they're resistant to erosion. That doesn't mean they don't erode. It just means they erode very, very, very slowly. However, if you go down underneath the sandstone layers, deeper into the mountain, eventually you will encounter other layers of rock that are soft and that are easy to erode, like limestones or shale layers, okay? And so the implication here, and this is a really cool point, is that a lot of times when we see mountains, the rocks that form the backbones of those mountains are really strong and really durable and very hard to erode. But when we see valleys, oftentimes it's because those rocks that underlie those valleys are very easy to erode away, either by acids in rainwater or by mechanical processes like floodwaters or some other force. They're just a lot easier to erode relative to the rocks up on the mountain. So this then means that the rocks determine where we have low areas like valleys and where we have high areas like mountains and hills. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as you know, I remember the first time I sort of got that. I was like, oh my gosh. I just sort of, I couldn't believe what I was reading, right? It makes sense now. But until someone pointed it out to me, I never would have come up with that on my own, I think. So imagine you're this lady and you're standing in this beautiful canyon in Alabama or somewhere in Tennessee, and you're looking around and you're oohing and ahhing over, what the landscape would have been like historically. You're looking at plants and animals and birds and whatnot. And if you're me, you're also worried about not slipping and falling on that wet rock, right? And breaking a hip or fracturing your back. But take a look at what is right beside her foot, and it is the fossilized remains of a tree trunk right there in the bed of that stream. Now, this particular fossil is called a scale tree, and they lived during the Mississippian period and the Pennsylvanian period back about 300 to 350 million years ago. So just an incredible, it's an incredible thought to think about how much has changed since that fossil would have been a living tree there at that same location. All the change and all those additional layers of rock that have been built up and in some cases eroded away, all the climatic changes and all the ecosystem changes, that's really what we want to kind of begin to explore. It's almost like if you were to go back in time, that part of Alabama today, if you were to go back to say 50 million years ago or 800 million years ago, it's like going almost to completely different worlds, but yet you're in the same location. And these conditions have changed so drastically in some cases that the exact same spot where she's standing at one point in history could be a deciduous forest. At another point in history, it could be the ocean. And yet still further back in history, it could be a desert or a tropical rainforest. That's the thing I want you to all to kind of understand, is that no matter where you are on planet Earth, if you go back far enough in time, it was drastically different in many different ways through the course of geologic time. This is just a quick way to kind of showcase this, right? And if you take a look here, you can see, at various points in time, kind of tracking where Alabama was. 540 million years ago, there at point number 1, Alabama was in the southern hemisphere, well below the equator, about where probably Chile and Argentina would be today. And as you come forward in time, up to the Ordovician period and eventually to the Mississippian, you'll see that the Earth, the axis of the Earth is changing, and the location of the equator is changing. So by the time you get to 340 million years ago, Alabama is actually then not really on land at all. It's kind of right at the edge of land and the edge of ocean, but also it's near the equator by that point. So it's very tropical and lush and wet during those times. Fast forward all the way over, though, to about where the Pennsylvanian period is, and maybe even a little bit later, and Alabama is going to go through, and Tennessee as well. So anytime I say Alabama, most of the time in this beginning sets of lectures, you can always assume that this also applies generally to Middle Tennessee, okay? But by the time we get up to about 300 to maybe 280 million years ago, up there between steps 4 and 5, we enter a time where Tennessee and Alabama become a vast desert. And all the proof of that is still all around us if we know where to look. And that's what I'm going to help you to understand. Now, a real key discipline or a key subject to understand in the general sort of scheme of geology especially is a subject called stratigraphy. Now, we're not going to get too deep into it, but I want to at least introduce it here. This is basically the understanding or the study of understanding the various layers of rock and soil. And what comes along with that is not only knowing which layers are in which order, but what type of rock they are and what specifically is the age of each of those layers, right? We want to be able to radiometrically date them. And so we want to know, are they exactly 72.3 million years old, or are they 25,000 years old, right? We want to understand that. And then we want to also understand the fossils and the minerals and the sediments that make up those layers. All that's important. And then if they're flat versus if they've been sort of tilted or uplifted or sometimes flipped completely upside down, that all is in the realm of what we call stratigraphy. Now, we're not going to get deeper than that, but I at least want to make sure that you guys are understanding that that is a very active area of geological research that informs a lot of what we're talking about. Now, this is a very famous road cut for geologists. This is called the Red Mountain Cut, and it's along I-65, just in the town or in the city of Birmingham there. And there's actually a place there where for a time, the city sort of had a walkway to where you could go up and look across at the other side of this road cut. And you can see all kinds of cool features in the rock. And a lot of that's been mapped out. And you'll see a lot of this particular road cut illustrated in your textbook. All right. One of the things about stratigraphy that's important to kind of cover is, and here's a sort of a more practical version of how we're going to apply it, right? I don't necessarily want you to know down at the specific geologic layer, you know, all the fine details. So you don't have to worry. I'm not gonna expect you to know that. What I want you to know though is how to kind of read the landscape from the layers that exist. So here's an example. This is that same valley we were looking across earlier. This is a valley that it's called Browns Valley, and Interstate 59 connects Birmingham to Chattanooga up and down this valley. So this is in northeastern Alabama, near the town of Fort Payne. If you look here, the valley floor is formed by Cambrian age rock from the Cambrian period. And so there again, I want you to know the general time constraints on those rocks. So these are about 510 million years old. Now the layer that's right above that, slightly higher, is the Ordovician period. Then notice you've got some Silurian and some Devonian. You got Mississippian, and then at the top of the mountain over there is the Pennsylvanian rocks. Take a look at how much time has gone by between when those Cambrian rocks were formed in the bottom of the valley to when those Pennsylvanian rocks were formed at the very top of the mountain, right? About 200 million years of time has gone by. That hopefully will give you an appreciation for how long it took those rocks to be laid down. Now, again, go back and keep in mind that this valley, when these rocks were initially laid down, this valley was not there, right? All the area that is currently valley would have been covered all the way up to the top with those same rock layers, all the way to the top of the mountain. It's only more recently, like in the past, 20, 30 million years, has this valley formed. So that's a whole different aspect that we're going to look at. Part of it is understanding which layers are there and how they got there. And then it's about understanding how those layers got removed to give us the modern landscape. That's also very important. Now, as you can see from this image, there's a lot of human impacts on this landscape, right? We could imagine there'd be things like logging and fires and all that kind of stuff. But also I want you to look at all the different ecosystems that probably would have been here, right? You've got sandstone cliffs up in the distance. There's probably Allegheny wood rats that nest underneath those cliff lines. There are big forested, a lot of forest on the mountain slope. Some of those up top are dry forest. Those down at the bottom are probably pretty moist. So there's going to be areas where there's creeks and salamanders. But then down in those very open valleys, some of those areas historically would have been open grassland or savannas. So it's important to realize that these different landforms are in many ways connected to, they're connected to all these types of ecosystems are really driven by those landforms. All right. Now, this is a cool map. We're going to go about another 10 minutes, then we're going to take our second break. So just bear with me for about another 10 minutes here. Any questions so far about anything we've covered? Awesome. Okay, so this last map this last image was about sort of understanding the different geologic periods within the Cenozoic era for a given landscape, okay? But this map or this block diagram here shows a different concept. Yes, there are periods on this map too, but really more of the focus is about what we call the epochs. And just in case, you're having trouble sort of understanding how that's spelled, you can see it's spelled up there at the top. EPOCH. So these are those different time sort of units of time that are within a period. Now, this is the southern part of Alabama. This is down below Birmingham. This is from about where Montgomery, Alabama is to the Gulf of Mexico. So that's probably about 150-mile sort of span of distance. And at the upper end of that, where Montgomery, Alabama is a line of hills called the Fall Line Hills. You'll see them here sort of in your upper right. Then if you notice, you'll see that and if you've ever driven to like Panama City or Destin, Florida, if you've come south from, say, Tennessee into Alabama, you notice that when you get south of Birmingham and you're driving toward Montgomery, there comes a point where as you're driving down this long, straight interstate, it's like you can just see forever, right? And that's because you're actually looking downhill. You're looking at a downhill slope all the way towards the ocean, although, of course, you can't see the ocean from that distance. So imagine then if you're just driving this interstate all this way, you go over every once in a while these little rises, these little hills. And those hills are called cuestas, C-U-E-S-T-A. And then there's little valleys in between, and you go over these cuestas. But generally speaking, it's sort of a rolling, gently hilly landscape, maybe sort of like a plain that's kind of broken. Now, let's take a look at what's happening underneath the ground, though, okay? While the layers are somewhat flat or rolling at the surface, the geologic layers underneath the ground are all fairly strongly sloping. And so starting back up here at around where Montgomery, Alabama is, if you go down deeply enough, you'll see there's a layer of really old rock, okay? But they don't come to the surface here. They're deeply buried. But what you see at the surface are various types of geologic layers. And these are what we call formations, okay? And so all through here, you can see different formations that come up and are exposed at the surface of the land at different points, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, these layers correspond to different geologic epochs. So, for example, you've got the Paleocene up in here, and then this is an old group. And then the younger ones occur on top of that, so that the youngest layers are down here at the coast. Remember the layers of the cake we talked about, or that deck of cards that are laid out. The cards are on the top are the youngest, and the cards on the bottom are the oldest, right? So the Pliocene, the Quaternary down here is the very youngest, followed by the older Pliocene and Miocene, and progressively older all the way back until you get to the Tuscaloosa group, way back in here. There's that deck of cards analogy one more time. And take a look at that map in the upper right and how those layers are exposed almost sequentially as you go from the Fall Line Hills, which is this dark green zone just south of Birmingham and around Tuscaloosa. And then as you go toward the coast, you go through these sequential layers all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, let's briefly talk about this concept of these groups and formations. You know, one skill that it's nice to develop is how to read geologic maps, at least enough to be sort of have a working knowledge of it. So in this particular case, you've got this fairly complicated map of Alabama on the left showing, you know, all the different regions with the different rock types, right, and the different rock ages. And then there's a nice sort of graph here on the right that shows those. And really they go from the oldest, in the case of these dark browns here, to the youngest at the very top. And what I want you to see is where two of these groups here called the Claiborne group and the Wilcox group come into play. And how does that look when you actually are trying to understand it on the land? Well, number one, these are both part of the Cenozoic era, okay? And specifically, these are in the early Cenozoic. So these would probably be somewhere around 60 to maybe 65 million year old formations. And the Claiborne group and the Wilcox group are found right here. There's the Eocene aged Wilcox, and there's the Eocene aged Claiborne. So they're really probably more about, I said 60 million years ago. They're probably more like 50 to 55 million years old. But they're right here successively on top of each other. And so we call these groups or formations, and they can be helpful to understand and how to read the land. Now, we're not going to get a lot into these specific sort of specific layers there, but I want you to at least know that formations and groups are important. They do exist, and we're going to mention them from time to time. Now, some of you may go on to get your degree in biology or geology, and maybe you want to pursue a career studying dinosaurs as a paleontologist. Well, then you're going to absolutely need to know things like stratigraphy, and you're going to need to know formations and groups very in depth and very well. For our purposes, we want to know that they exist. We want to know kind of how to read them on a map, but we don't have to really go much deeper than that. All right, the last thing I want to show on this particular slide is take a look at the kinds of rocks and the kinds of other sediments that make up these different layers, these groups and formations. So you'll notice here you've got some that are limestone, for example, like the Eocene Jackson Formation is a limestone layer. Then you've got some sandstone represented by, let's say, the Eocene Wilcox Formation, right? Some are shale and clay. And then you've got some older rocks here that are various. So I'm going to ask you a question. What pattern do you notice between, let's say, the limestone areas and what type of landform those limestone areas support? I hope that question is clear. Talk to me.
Well, it looks like the limestone, I'm looking at the Jackson and the Selma or the Rip, well, I don't know. Yeah. They're all supporting the green colors. One's
They are
light-
the green colors. Yeah.
Mhm. One's darker, one's lighter, but I'm assuming that means healthy vegetation.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to ask somebody else to consider is, let's take a look at that Eocene Jackson limestone formation right here. Can y'all see my cursor?
It looks like a valley.
Exactly. Is that you, Matthew?
It's Brandon.
Hey, Brandon. All right, good. That's a valley. And then notice over here with this one where we have the shale and clay of the Paleocene Midway group. What do you notice there?
Same thing.
Yep. And then finally, the Selma chalk right here. Same thing, right? So in all those cases, limestone, shale, and clay, generally speaking, those are very erosion prone rock formations. So because of that, you would expect them to erode very easily, and therefore that's where you would expect your valleys to be. And that's exactly what we're seeing. In contrast to that, you would expect things like sandstone and maybe other kinds of rocks, which are very erosion resistant, to form your ridges or your cuestas, right? So that's where you see these ridge lines that are formed of these more durable erosion resistant rocks. So the key point here is that everything about the way the land looks, like where there's a valley, where there's a ridge or a mountain system or a basin, has everything to do with the kind of rock formation that is underneath it. Does that make sense? Let's take a break here. We're going to take a 10-minute break at 6:40. We'll come back at 6:50, and then we'll get started with the rock cycle and get into some specific types of rocks. All right, break time. Okay, welcome back, everybody.
Woohoo!
Woohoo! All right. Well, I hope y'all are having as much fun as I am, because hell, I'm having a good time here. All right. Okay, so what I think has been pretty clear is that there's a lot of change that's happened. It's important to know these, the geologic time periods and sort of the different layers are really critical to understanding Earth history, the region's history, why certain species live where they do and where they don't. I mean, things like, a valley versus the mountain being located where they are at the very core, that's because of geology. So obviously that's going to impact all kinds of things, like where are rivers, where do caves form, wind patterns. I mean, just so much stuff is informed by this first sort of deep look at really the foundation of our environment, right? That's what we're talking about. Okay, now what we need to figure out and gain a deeper appreciation for is the rocks that make up each of these kinds of regions or each of these layers. And so what I'm about to tell you, I'm sure goes back to your elementary school days, the concept of sort of three major kinds of rocks, the rock cycle. Generally, we can kind of divide pretty much all rocks into three basic categories. Sedimentary rocks, which is all the kinds of rocks around Middle Tennessee and Kentucky, for example. Excuse me, they're all going to be sedimentary rocks. Metamorphic rocks are rocks that have been subjected to heat and pressure that comes with mountain building. So you're only going to find metamorphic rocks in areas that either are existing mountain ranges or that prehistorically, were mountain ranges at one time. And then finally, igneous rocks are those that are the result of the cooling of magma and lava that are the result of various types of volcanic processes. So we don't really see a lot of igneous rocks in this region, although, as I pointed out earlier, there are some in Missouri, and there are some in far northeast Tennessee and in western North Carolina. All three are in the region if you know where to look, and that's very important. Now, all these three rocks can transform into each other, essentially, right? Sedimentary rocks can become metamorphic. So take a look at this diagram here in the upper right. When subjected to the forces of mountain building, and by the way, that's called orogenies, and I'm going to put that into the chat box, okay? And please forgive me, some of you who put some things in the chat box earlier. I found it a little difficult to manage both the chat and talk back and forth. So I may have missed some of your answers for some of you when you were putting that up. But anyways, and now I can't seem to find where my chat box is. It's disappeared for me. I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, so when sedimentary rocks are subjected to mountain building forces or orogenies, orogenies, then those sedimentary rocks can be molded and melted and formed into a variety of metamorphic types. For example, when limestone, which is a sedimentary rock, undergoes metamorphism, it becomes marble. Most of you probably heard about marble, right? Both sedimentary and metamorphic rocks, if they are melted through process of being very deeply buried and basically melted because of they're so close to the mantle that they become molten again, then they can become igneous rocks at some point. So they're all three connected to one another. And then both igneous and metamorphic rocks, as they erode away into their very base sands, their base grains of, as they erode into, say, grains of quartzite or other kinds of particles or clay, those particles then can be reincorporated into a new rock called sedimentary rocks. All right. So another thing that's a big driver in the rock cycle involves plate tectonics. and maybe that's a surprise to some of you, but one of the ways, for example, that both sedimentary rocks and metamorphic rocks can be converted into igneous rocks is that they have to be melted. And one of the ways that that happens is if they are deeply buried underneath the crust by a process called subduction. And that involves when, let's say, two tectonic plates collide with one another. One of those plates has to go under. It doesn't have to, but in many cases it may go under. And if it goes down deeply enough, those rocks that form that crust can get buried so deeply that they become close in proximity to the Earth's mantle, extremely hot temperatures, and then those rocks can melt and then be exuded back up to the surface through either as magma or eventually as lava through volcanic processes. So there's a whole interconnectedness then of these rocks, and the plate tectonics is the big driver in terms of the sort of remelting of some of those rocks. Now, we're going to come back and touch on plate tectonics later because that's a big focus of, especially of probably the third week of class. We'll get into that a lot. I just want to introduce it here today preliminarily. There are some types of rocks that, such as basalt, which is not one that we routinely think about here in the Mid-South. There are some basalt deposits that are in far northeast Tennessee, literally right on the edge of Virginia and North Carolina, also up in upper northwest North Carolina and parts of Virginia. Basalt is an extremely heavy type of igneous rock that is formed as ocean crust. So let that sit in with you for a second. How do we explain having a rock that forms as part of oceanic crust, but yet today it's found in the mountains of the Appalachians of Tennessee and Virginia? Any thoughts on that? How'd they get there?
We used to have a coast here.
Okay, now, is that you, Brandon?
Yeah.
So think about that for a second. So in this diagram up here, basalt rock is going to form especially on the ocean crust, which is down on sort of the bottom of the ocean, like in the deeper oceanic zones. So not so much on the coastline, but more like in the very deep abyssal zones of the ocean. So how do we explain that type of rock that is forming there? Like, let's say adjacent to these deep sea thermal vents, like in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. That's kind of where basalt is forming right there. How do we explain its presence in the Appalachians?
Would it be a tectonic plate uplift?
Okay, that's right. So as those tectonic plates are moving together, let's say Africa is moving to collide with North America. Keep in mind that all the ocean in between is being uplifted and it's being shoved together, right? So in that process, that's how we explain the presence of these rock types that really only form in the depths of the ocean here on land in places like the Appalachians of Tennessee and Virginia. And there are other types of rocks like the serpentine, for example, which we talked about at the very, very beginning. Serpentine rocks form adjacent to mid-oceanic deep sea thermal vents. So for them now to be on a mountainside in North Carolina at 3,000 feet, supporting plants that occur nowhere else in the world, that's a pretty cool concept that those rocks really originated adjacent to the mid-oceanic ridge in the Atlantic Ocean, or in the precursor, the ancestor to the Atlantic Ocean, not the modern Atlantic Ocean. All right, so basalt is one of those wacky rocks. We've got other types like granite, for example. Granite forms deep underground, adjacent to these magma chambers. So for example, if you see some of these areas here where you can see these underground magma, excuse me, let me get my underground magma chambers. You see where these plumes of magma are rising through the crust? And then they rise up and eventually they may be released as lava. But adjacent to that is where that magma is cooling. and it slowly cools and forms into igneous rock called granite. That's where we find that type of rock. So when we begin to explore these rock types, just know that they may have formed in places so far away or so different from their modern position. And there's a lot we can understand by when we find a rock of a certain kind in a place, that rock and its location and the chemicals that make it up, the elements that it is composed of, the minerals that are in it, all that tells a deep story that especially is relevant to geologists. But if we can learn a few of those clues too, as biologists, and then we can fold them into this broader story and have a much better understanding of the ecosystems that are around us. So plate tectonics, as I said, we're going to come back to and touch on. Right now, I'm just going to kind of leave it here, but we'll definitely come back. And if you're having an idea of what does plate tectonics look like, I've got a little video link in here. Let me just click that real quick. Let's take a look at it. Are y'all able to see this, by the way, the YouTube?
No.
Okay,
No, I
gotcha.
got
To
it.
the link right now.
Let me drag it over to my other page. Give me 1 second, okay?
What a drag.
What a drag. Yeah, let me drag it over here. I think it's because I've got to minimize that. How about now?
Yep.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes.
But the huge molten core contributes something else essential for life on Earth. A way of helping to regulate the planet's temperature. It's a remarkable system. Magma heated by the core rises towards the Earth's surface. As it spreads sideways, the Earth's crust is very slowly dragged apart. This moves the continents, creating the Earth's restless and ever-changing surface.
So not that long of a clip, but just kind of a neat little graphic to kind of show. You could search for those all day long on YouTube and find all kinds of cool videos of plate tectonics. As I said, we'll get back into that more in depth. Actually, I probably need to even have a better video. That one wasn't as good as I thought. Okay, now part of the evidence for this history of rocks can be seen, and like in this particular photograph, this is a chunk of sandstone from Alabama. And if you look here, there's a lot going on in here. And I'll just sort of break it down into sort of the core parts. Sandstone is a type of sedimentary rock, okay? It's formed after sand deposits build up and solidify into a type of rock called sandstone over time. And so those sediments that are building up and become consolidated form into that type of rock called sandstone. But sandstone's oftentimes not pure, right? It can have other things in it. It has maybe various types of other elements or minerals like calcite. It has sand grains that are formed out of quartzite and silicate materials and other kinds of things. You may have heard many of these terms from like chemistry, for example. But also they are, as these sands are, let's say, washing up on a beach, for example, they're also incorporating all kinds of other grains that have been washed away from a nearby mountain range or carried there by a river. And so these eventually get incorporated into this newly forming rock, in this case, a sandstone layer. So let's take a look at what's here. At the top of this, you can see there's some little mineral flakes called mica. And these are the sort of the dark mineral grains that you see here, but those were weathered away from igneous rocks or metamorphic rocks. Now, keep in mind, this is Alabama, right? There are no modern day volcanoes. So the fact that these grains are here means that when this rock formed, 300 million years ago, that those grains had come from somewhere else that had already like eroded away. Maybe they were being washed in from a mountain range in South America and incorporated. Those grains were incorporated sort of like reincarnation, right? They used to be igneous rocks that formed a mountain in South America that got eroded away and carried into Alabama, only to be reincorporated or reincarnated into another kind of rock, in this case, a sedimentary rock in northern Alabama. So just know that those individual grains can become parts of rock. They can become eroded and go away and become parts of other rocks. So they have a long life that can literally can live. These individual grains can live billions and billions of years. They can not live, but they can be carried on through billions of years of time. Also in this particular segment, you can see a piece of coal here, a piece of plant material that has been what's called coalified, which means that it's subjected to heat and pressure. And those tissues, whether that's a stem or a leaf, have sort of been turned into coal, which is a type of sedimentary material as well. All right. One of the key things to understanding rocks as we start to get in, we've kind of just introduced the very basics of sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous. But now let's talk about what we call depositional environments. This really makes a lot of difference because not all landscapes are depositional environments, right? They're not actively receiving deposits of sediments. Take those mountains in the very background of this image, right? Most of the sediments that are there are being washed away. Either they're carried down slope by the glaciers or rainfall or just gravity. But they're not actively settling on that landscape. They're being eroded off the mountain. So the mountain is, generally speaking, not a depositional environment. It's not a place that's receiving deposits of new sediments that are being eroded. Instead, the rivers that are carrying away, the streams are carrying away off that mountain, are carrying those sediment loads onto, let's say, the coastal plain or a river valley. Or maybe they carry them into a basin or a bog. These are types of places that are depositional environments. So that river then may flow on out and form a delta at its mouth, in which case some of those sediments like clay particles or sand particles may sift themselves out and form that alluvial plain or that river delta. Some sediments even still may carry even farther on out, landing eventually out onto the continental shelf here. If you're looking along, I'm sort of looking at this river and thinking about all those particles being dropped, right? Right here at the base of the mountain, you'd expect big boulders and cobblestones to deposit right along the edge of the river. And as you go forward, even farther down, smaller particles like cobblestones and gravel mixed with sand, they get deposited along the river in the adjacent floodplain. The farther you go from those mountains where those rocks originate, then those particle sizes get smaller and smaller and smaller. So then eventually it forms as the smallest particles are like silt and clay that are getting deposited out here near the mouth of this delta. And then finally, those particles which are the smallest and are able to carry out suspended in the water out into the ocean. Imagine where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Then those smallest particles, like even sand is too heavy to carry out to sea and they be dropped, let's say 500 miles out into the Gulf. It's too heavy. Those sand grains would just simply eventually sink near the coastline and build up that sandy beach. So to get out there, if you're looking at the image on the bottom, for example, if there's a river, sand will tend to sort of accumulate right here along the beach zone. But suspended in that water, especially if those waters are pretty quiet, all the way out here, as it gets deeper and deeper, you can have clay particles that will suspend out and eventually they'll settle down to the bottom of the ocean, a few hundred feet below. So what does all this mean? It means that areas where sand settles or deposits, Eventually, they may change and become sandstone. Areas where clay settles and deposits, when conditions change and there's no longer an ocean there, they may turn into an area of rock that's dominated by shale. If you have shallow coral reefs, for example, out here, maybe 50 to 100 feet off the coastline, you may have some warm sort of subtropical waters where there are coral reefs and other kinds of things. As those change, those areas will form limestone. So when we think now about the rocks around Clarksville, for example, like limestone and chert and sandstone and shale, we can look immediately at all those rocks, and then we know what kind of depositional environment those rocks were formed in. If you see limestone, you can be sure those rocks were formed in tropical to subtropical shallow seas, where there was lots of calcium precipitating out of the water. If you see sandstone, you can be confident that those areas were formed in a sandy environment, such as along a beach or a coastline. So that tells us a lot about the kind of rocks that we're looking at today is the depositional environment. Any questions about that? Now, I don't want you guys to memorize all those different, features of the land, right? Again, this is not 10th grade geography class here. I assume most of you know what a barrier island is, or, the abyssal zones of the ocean, and some of those stuff we don't get too deep into here. But I do want you to especially just be aware of the depositional environment and what that means for the kind of rock. And we're going to just generally, we'll be talking about that as we go over the next few weeks. All right. I want to introduce, and yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, sorry. It took me a minute to figure out how to ask. I'm understanding about the depositional layers and the rocks that are formed.
Yeah.
So when I see limestone, I can be sure that it was a shallow sea, et cetera. But is it like where we see the limestones in church around here, did the waters recede, or has there been uplift, which is why we see it at the surface? Or what is that next step after those rocks were formed that we now see it at the surface?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. It's a perfect question. So we may be seeing those limestones today at the surface, but when they were formed, yes, indeed, they were in a shallow, warm ocean environment, right? But then they may have been covered by different layers. And that's actually what I'm about to show you now is how you can see these different kinds of layers stacked on top of each other. And what that indicates then is change has happened in that particular location. So it might have gone from being an ocean to something totally different. So we'll explore that in a minute. And then what you're seeing today is that something had to cause those other layers that were once on top of it to get eroded away. And that's what we'll spend, a few weeks talking about, those kinds of processes. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks.
So let's introduce that. Great question. I'm going to give you an example from Alabama, but again, it also applies to Tennessee. And I'm going to introduce a new term here, which is called an unconformity. All right. Unconformity. And this one is called the Great Fall Line Unconformity. So basically, here's the gist of it. An unconformity is a missing layer of rocks from the record. So imagine if you have a rock layer and you everything you're seeing up to a certain point is expected and it's of a certain age. And then all of a sudden you got this other rock layer on top of it, but it's dramatically younger, right? And you know that there's a missing gap there that's just not there for some reason that you can't explain. Well, geologists have discovered this. It's very common in the world of geology to have these missing layers, and we're going to explore that a little bit. So one of these is found here in Alabama to the west of Birmingham. And you can see, for example, where here you've got these really old rocks of Pennsylvanian age, 310 million year old rocks. And then they're older, right? So they're on the bottom. And then on top of that, you got these younger, the ones in green, Cretaceous rocks that are about 90 million years old. So you're missing 200 million years of the rock record, of the evolutionary record. right? Just imagine all the fossils that you might want to see. Well, if you want fossils from 150 million years ago in that zone, you're just out of luck because they don't exist there anymore, right? So back to this example, which I've shown previously. Notice now I've added this heavy red line here over here on the right. And that red line shows the unconformity that exists, where you have these really old Paleozoic rocks. Again, some of them coming up to about 320 million years old. And then you have that very young Tuscaloosa group, which is Cretaceous aged at about 90 million years. So you're missing that 200 million year gap that's no longer there. And to show that in terms of time, what does that mean? Well, that means that in this particular case, missing from Alabama and from Tennessee are all of the rocks of the Permian period, all of the rocks of the Triassic period, all the rocks of the Jurassic period, and the first half of the Cretaceous period are all missing from that unconformity, okay? Now, think about that. What kinds of things lived during those periods? Well, we're talking about, at least 3/4 of all dinosaurs would be missing from that record that lived at that time, right? We're missing just a huge bit of information that is no longer there. So the question is where did it all go? Let me ask you that and get some answers from you. Where did the Jurassic, Triassic, and Permian rocks and sediments go if they're no longer there today?
Some sort of erosion, maybe.
Yep, they were eroded away. Yep, and if you had to propose where they are today, I mean, are they just gone forever? We gave the example that some rocks are kind of reincarnated; they become incorporated into new rocks. Are they sort of incorporated in some new formation somewhere else, or are they just gone entirely?
They can't be just gone entirely. I don't know. I can't answer the question, but I know they've.
Okay, Nancy, let's see. Nancy, tell me your name. Kiki?
Yes.
Kiki, what do you think? It looks like you were going to answer.
I assume that they would have been incorporated into newer formations once they were broken down into smaller pieces.
Okay, all right. Jacob, what do you think?
I kind of figured the same as Nancy, that as they're broken into pieces.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let's think about this. I want to show you one more clue before you decide to move on from here. Take a look at that sloping landscape, right? What is there any clue that maybe gives you some idea from looking at this?
The
Ian?
rock has been pushed up
Were
on
they
one side.
subducted?
Go ahead, Brendan. What were you saying?
I said the rock has been pushed up on one side.
That's a key observation, Brandon. Also, one of the things we'll talk about in this class is sometimes things do push things up, right? You might expect that. But also don't discount the fact that that land weighs a lot, okay? The actual crust in the mountains it has a ton of weight. So it actually can have a depressive effect. It can weigh down and sink into the mantle of the upper mantle. So you could have two forces. You could have uplift and you could have sort of the weighing down of materials as well. There's a name for that that's escaping me at the moment. Subsidence. That's the word I'm looking for. Subsidence. Any other thoughts here as to where those layers might be?
Did they slide underneath the Tuscaloosa group?
Oh, like a big landslide kind of effect?
Through like a plate tectonic shift, maybe?
Okay, that's certainly worthy of consideration. Well, we're going to explore this more deeply in a couple of weeks, but one thing I'll just say is that the people who solved this riddle were petrogeologists. What does that tell you? Anything?
Like
Oh, sorry.
Is it in the Gulf of Mexico?
It's in the Gulf of Mexico. Yes. So the people who were exploring for natural gas and oil deposits in the underneath the Gulf of Mexico, right out there on those oil platforms, they're drilling down looking for oil and natural gas deposits. Well, those companies tend to hire geologists who know stratigraphy, right? They know exactly the layers and they know what to look for. And so as you're going down, let's say from where Mobile, Alabama is, which is right here at the entrance of this bay, Mobile sits there. There's a lot of oil rigs and stuff. They're drilling down into that, and they're actually going down like 4 or 5 miles deep. That's how deep they're able to go. And as they're doing that, they're able to look through all the rock layers, and basically they can go back in time from the most recent rocks of the Quaternary and the Pliocene and the Miocene and the Oligocene. They're going all the way back in time. And guess what? At about 4 to 5 miles below Mobile, Alabama, are the missing rocks that are no longer on the shores or the land of Eastern North America. The Jurassic and Triassic and Permian deposits are all there, 4 to 5 miles deep underneath the coast of Alabama. How's that? That's pretty cool, huh?
That's crazy.
Now we're going to come back and see what those rocks reveal in terms of what the ecosystem types were, especially during the Permian, and it's going to shock you. But I'll wait on that, and we'll come back to that in a couple of weeks. So just file that away. Okay, so now all that's missing. That's cool. That's called an unconformity. And here's what that looks like. If you're actually looking at it, say from the side of an abandoned coal mine here down near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, you can see where the younger Cretaceous gravels are up at the top, and then they directly overlay the older Pennsylvanian rocks. And again, there's a 200 million year gap there. All right, so that's an unconformity. Now, what I want you to think about next is here's another site. This is a quarry in North Alabama. And I want you to look in the wall of that quarry. Notice that you've got at the very bottom, Churty limestone. Above that is just pure limestone. Then there's a shale layer and sandstone and more shale. And then at the top, you've got a mixture, of chert pebbles, sand, and conglomerate. Now, just imagine this is one place on Earth, right? And you're just digging down, looking at all those rocks that are there. Different kinds of rocks changing in the same spot on Earth. Very simple question. What causes the change at that one particular location from, say, limestone to form there? See how thick that limestone is? Whatever conditions were in place for that limestone to form there for as long as it did, that was a long period of consistency, right? And we know, because limestone forms in shallow seas, at least that's what I'm telling you, that probably lasted for tens of millions of years of consistent conditions. But then something happened to make it go from forming limestone to forming a band of shale, right? And then from shale to sandstone. So what I want to know from you guys, or what are your thoughts on why that is? Why do you have that changeover at the same site? Give me some answers.
Would it be environmental conditions?
Go ahead, Jacob.
I was going to say, would it be environmental conditions, or would it be related to that in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, elaborate on that just a bit, if you would. What kinds of different environmental conditions are you thinking about?
I mean, honestly, the amount of rainfall that could possibly be there, or the types of trees, grass, shrubs growing on the surface. Because, I mean, if there's a big overgrowth layer, it's not really going to have the erosion as it would if it was just wide open ground.
Okay, now, Jacob, let's go back real quick, right? So limestone, when that rock was there, that was ocean, right? That was shallow marine environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells you a lot about its depositional environment, right? Where those deposits were initially made. That's exactly, that's the linkage I want you to think about. And
Yeah.
now we got to think about, okay, what's the depositional environment for, say, sandstone? Like, what kind of conditions does sandstone form under, right?
Yeah. Right near the coastal areas.
Yeah, it could be right on the coast, on the beach, a barrier island, or just off the coast a little bit. But it's where the wave action is strong enough to where you're getting that sand buildup, right?
Hmm.
So in no part of that really are we talking about soil or plants or rainfall. It's really about kind of what's the depositional environment. That's what I want you to come back to, Jacob, time and time again. Now, there
Yeah.
are cases of sedimentary rocks like coal where absolutely you do want to think about the rainfall and the kind of plants and stuff that were there, because that matters. All right, there's somebody else who's going to chime in with an answer. Anything you want to add to that?
I was
Is
gonna
it-
say maybe the sea level is like lowered due to like continental shifts.
Yes, absolutely. So, and just to build on what Jacob was saying, yes, it is environmental change. Absolutely, Jacob. And then James, to your point, what's driving that change is sea level change. Okay. So the difference in being at this particular site, just imagine being there like, say, 100 million years ago. Okay. Then at that site, maybe you're standing, if you're on the surface, maybe you're in 50 feet of shallow water in a lagoon that's a warm seawater, right? Well, under that condition, you're going to expect limestone to form right there, 50 feet underwater. But maybe in another 50 million years, the land surface has risen and you're actually slightly above the ocean level now. You're on a beach, right? But you're in the same spot. But yet sea level has changed, which means that now in that same spot, you're going to get sand depositing instead of the materials that lead to limestone. And then finally, what about shale? Well, in that case, the water has probably deepened. And so you're too deep for limestone formation and too deep for sandstone. So you're temporarily in water that maybe, say, is 200 or 300 feet deep, maybe 500 feet deep. And that's where those very fine shale particles are settling out and just slowly settling to the bottom of that water body. So yes, it has to do with the depth of water at that location, how deep you are, or whether you're at the surface or whether you're slightly above the surface. Laura?
Does it have anything, or does a marine environment versus an aquatic environment determine limestone or shale? I mean, does that have any play on it?
Well, so limestones all form in marine environments, but shales, to your point, absolutely great question. Shales can form under either freshwater conditions, so like in a floodplain of a river valley, so for example, or in a swamp. That's a great place for shale deposits. Those are all freshwater shales. And then marine shales form in marine environments. So, how would you know the difference between the two? You'd probably have to look at the fossil composition. And there probably also are some chemical signatures that you could glean from that as well. Now, the last thing I want to point to you is look at the very highest layer. All right. Then as you go up, you've got things like conglomerate and sand and chert pebbles. And I know we haven't talked about each of these types of rocks in detail yet, so I'm just kind of introducing it. But basically, again, conditions have changed. In this case, maybe you're actually on a river floodplain that is receiving gravel from sediments that are washing down off of an adjacent mountain range or something. So you would expect larger rock particles to be part of that layer. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of terms here. One is called a transgression, which means these are areas where these changes in sea level. There's transgressions and regressions. So when you're at a given site and you're experiencing, say, sea level rise, that's a transgression. When you're at that same site and the sea level drops again, that's called a regression. And that's what is accounting for this difference in layers as you go through the rock column there. Now, these are, incredible. So you can see all kinds of stuff. And if you're, again, a true geologist that is really trained in this stuff, you can you can glean all kinds of cool information. Here's some oyster fossils that are preserved in here. And in some of these, like this is a high bluff, you actually have high river terrace deposits. So here, these were silts and sands that were deposited in a river valley. And then the river has subsequently sort of cut down through this valley. And you can see those high deposits that are on the top of this cliff line here. Some of these are pure sandstone. So here, this is in North Alabama. This is a site one of my graduate students studied a few years ago. And it's just a complete thick bed of almost pure sandstone that suggests that this was probably a sandy beach environment or coastal environment for a very long period of time. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to just begin now to introduce you to some of the major rock types. That's going to be a key thing that we'll discuss into next class period. And so we're going to start with a few types of formations that they're not a specific kind of rock necessarily. They're not like limestone or sandstone, but these are just kinds of deposits that are not really consolidated into a pure mass. And so we call these unconsolidated formations. So here's a few of them that I want you to kind of be considerate of. Number one, you could have what's called loess, and that's a complicated looking word there, Loess. And loess is basically just a very fine wind-blown sediment. We're going to come back and talk about it a lot. So you don't have to memorize it now. Just know that I want to expose you to it. We'll come back and touch on it. But it is so fine and wind-blown, it's like flour. It just kind of blows in the wind. And that actually is the key to where you find loess deposits. They are formed because they've been blown into piles of sediment by winds at some point in time. Gravel deposits. We've all seen, gravel deposits, of course, on gravel bars of streams, but oftentimes, particularly in places nearby here, like Land Between the Lakes, National Recreation Area, or if you live in some of the counties southwest of Clarksville, like I live in Dixon County or Humphreys County, those counties, a lot of the hilltops are capped in these layers of gravel, which used to be the ancient coastline of America about 90 million years ago. Down along river floodplains, you can have alluvial deposits where these are very recent sediments that have been laid down by the floods of rivers over time. So these are mostly silts and sands that have formed these alluvial floodplains. In a lot of West Tennessee, you have very deep deposits of sand formations that have built up over time. And then finally, on some of the mountain slopes, particularly where you have very steep mountainous lands, you can have extensive deposits of what are called colluvium. Colluvium is where you have these sort of jumbled masses of cobblestones and boulders that are largely breaking off of the rock faces or the mountaintop and just sort of tumbling down and they sort of form a blanket over the mountainside. And so these rocks really originate upslope. And they're very different from the rocks sometimes that are immediately actually part of the bedrock underground. But these are loose rocks that have sort of just made their way by gravitational pull down the slope as they've just sort of been tumbling down over time. So this is called colluvium, and it's a term we're going to need to think about. Just a few images of these. So here's some close-ups of gravel beds. Again, this is not consolidated rock, right? You could easily take a shovel or, a pickaxe and just kind of dig into this. So it's not like you're trying to bust up into a solid bedrock layer. These are obviously beds of unconsolidated materials. Now, the bulk of what we're going to talk about next, and I think what I'll do is just sort of introduce this for a bit, and then I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions. Where we're going to pick up next time is we're going to introduce the actual specific kinds of rocks. So we'll start with sedimentary rocks. Then we'll probably get into the metamorphic rocks, and then we'll conclude with igneous rocks. And this will take us through pretty much all the lecture next Tuesday will be devoted to the second second part of our geology introduction. And then once we're done with geology, then we can move on to other topics, and we will have at least introduced it as a foundation. Now, as part of us meeting in class, I also have a lot of these rocks, which I'm going to put out, and you'll be able to touch them and feel them and kind of, you know, at least the basic important types that you ought to know. So when we begin next Tuesday, we'll start with sedimentary, and you know, a lot of these are really common rock types around here that I will introduce to you. And I will definitely expect you guys to sort of be familiar with the basic types. As I said, you can get real complicated with geology. It gets real complicated real fast. I just want to give you a good working knowledge so that you can you have enough to be dangerous and to work with, and to where you can understand the world around you. Let me stop there. Let me ask everybody, if you don't have to, but those of you who want to turn your camera back on, if you want, let's just have a quick couple minutes to debrief and discuss. And I would like to know if, how you guys are doing, and if the pace of the class so far is okay. And if there's anything that you'd like to tell me or anything, go ahead. How you guys doing out there? Is it making sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Good deal.
Yeah, it's cool.
Pace going okay?
Definitely making sense. I think it'll be a whole lot easier once we're actually, lecturing in person.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in person, it's more fun. We're all kind of carrying on and discussing, and I can see you all. It's a lot better that way. Okay. All right. Any questions about any of the content we've covered, or anything else about the class as I've sort of laid it out to you? Awesome.
I
I
didn't.
do have a.
Go ahead.
Or, you can go ahead.
I wasn't prepared and didn't take notes about the periods that you were and the certain ones that we needed to know. Is that in a syllabus or in a assignment somewhere? Review?
It's in it's in all the materials I get. So one is it's in that geology chapter that I wrote. It's
Right.
in your text, it's in the book, right? And then of course it's in the PowerPoint, and I'm going to give you a recording in the PowerPoint. So that's, I feel like between all that stuff, it will take, and that's a good question. I think in that case, it's going to require just a little bit of focused memorization on your part. But then I'm going to touch on that stuff so much this semester that, you're not going to have any choice but to get it. But what I would rather you do is make sure you go ahead and spend some time forcing it into your brain, so that when I say it, and when I say the time periods, you are already kind of thinking about, it's about 90 million years ago, right? The quicker you can get that, the quicker it's going to make sense to you.
Okay, great. The arrows and the periods and the years.
And the epochs of the
Epics.
Cenozoic era. Yeah.
Epics, periods, years. Thank you.
You got it. Any other questions?
I did have one.
Yes.
When you're talking about the depositional environments, that was a little unclear for me.
Yeah. Again, all we're really thinking about is where do sediments collect naturally on the landscape from erosion, like versus where are they being washed away from, right? So that's where they're eroding from. We want to know where are they going to, because where they're going to, those are the depositional environments, like ponds, bogs, coastlines, alluvial plains. And then if you know what the depositional environment is, then you should be able to predict what type of rock would form there eventually under the right circumstances, right? And we're going to talk about this a bunch too, James. So if it's not super clear now, I promise you it will become clear in the next couple lectures.
Okay. Thanks.
You got it. All right. Any other questions? Great. Well, listen, I'll follow up with just a quick email about the the eras and the periods and epochs to know, just to make sure you do that. But otherwise, I will also share with you the recording of this lecture so you can listen to it as many times you want to. And fall asleep at night, listen to it if you want to with some earbuds in. Y'all have a good night. I appreciate it. Look forward to meeting you all, seeing you all in person next Tuesday.
You too. Thank you.
I can see you next Tuesday.
You have a
Bye,
good
everybody.
night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a minute?
I sure do. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any questions about my disability.
Let's see. James, I don't think I may have missed your email. Do you want to freshen my memory of that? And then if I'll be happy to make sure I go back in case I missed your email.
Oh yeah, you're good. So my major thing is I take a little bit longer on testing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that'd be much of a challenge in this class since I think there's only like 2.
No, that's not a challenge at all. Yeah.
Yeah. And then preferential seating. So I like sitting near the front of the classroom just because of anxiety. It helps if I'm like have like I guess a more open area in air quotes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you
And
can
so I
come in
can-
and I'll be sure you and I'll be sure to work together. You can sit where you'd like. There should be no shortage of seats up front in the classroom. So there's probably about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 places, I think, in that classroom where you could get a front row seat and sort of be near a door if you need to, that kind of thing. So you
All right.
just, I'll work with you. If you need to make sure you're in the right spot, just let me know if you don't have what you need.
All right. That should be it.
Excellent. Well, it's good to have you in class, and I'll look forward to meeting you in person next Tuesday.
All right. I'll see you then.
See
Thank
man.
you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Thanks. How do I